Hello, my name is Diane, and today I want to talk about everything I read in April. Last month I read from a total of 16 things. Some of them were from the TBR, things I was planning on reading. 7 of them were from a single series. I read a short story, a couple of things that I DNF'd, got into, decided they really weren't working for me, and decided to give up on them. So let's talk about what they were. First up, I read Infinity Gate by M.R. Carey. This is the first book in a new sci-fi series, which takes place in a world where the Pandemonium is this trade organization alliance between many worlds, but all of the worlds are actually just different versions of Earth existing in different parallel dimensions. And at some point, this AI threat comes about that could undo everything that the Pandemonium has built. 3 main characters played a role in letting that AI get to the point it got to, and this starts from the beginning where we're meeting our 3 main characters, the 3 main players in that event, and learning how they came to be involved with the AI and with one another. So this is sort of a how the group got together kind of first book, which isn't really my favorite setup for a storyline, but I did think this was a really engaging story from start to finish. I do wish there was a little bit more concrete of an ending, a little bit more information given, but it ultimately ends where they all come together. There's a lot more to it, but obviously I don't want to spoil it. But I did really like the 3 main characters. I thought the worlds were really interesting, the different variations between them, as well as how they all interact with one another and who's aware of that information and that reality and who's not aware of that and accidentally stumbles upon it or has it thrust upon them. But I really loved this story. I'm looking forward to the next one and seeing where our characters go next and how the AI really comes to be what we're expecting it to be. So yeah, good first book to start off the month with. Then after that, I read the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire. This includes Every Heart a Doorway, Down Among the Sticks and Bones, Beneath the Sugar Sky, In an Absent Dream, Come Tumbling Down, Across the Green Grass Fields, Where the Drowned Girls Go, and there is an 8th book out, but I decided not to read that. This series follows children or young people. They're not really children. I think they're mostly teenagers. Some of them are a bit younger, but the ones I read were mostly teenagers who have something going on in their real lives that causes them to want an escape, and they end up finding a doorway or a passageway to a portal fantasy world. They end up going there, spending quite a bit of time there, and then returning to their real lives for whatever reason. And in these stories, it's mostly children who want to get back to that magical world that felt like home to them. They don't like where they are now. They don't like the real world, and they just want to get back to their magical fantasy world and live there for the rest of their lives. So each story follows a different character. They all kind of intertwine a bit, but they also all really stand on their own as individual storylines. I really liked the world and the setup of these, but I ultimately didn't really care for the writing. It just didn't really do much for me. I didn't really connect with it. So this is a beloved series. There is a lot of praise surrounding it. It's won a lot of awards, and I just wanted to see what all the hype was about. I really don't think it's for me. I don't think Seanan McGuire's writing is for me, and I think that's mostly what it came down to. But I read 7 of these books. I think it's a very interesting overall storyline and setup, so worth checking out if that interests you, but not really one I'm probably going to be recommending in the future just because it didn't work for me. Then I read Where Oaken Hearts Do Gather by Sarah Pinsker. This is a short story written in a format that resembles a website forum or comment section more specifically. It shows a web page that the The website is for people to discuss music lyrics, and this page in particular is an old English folk song, which is a fictional folk song, but it follows the usernames of people who are commenting and discussing this folk song, and it kind of gives you the verses of the story one at a time, the verses of the folk song, and then you get the comments of the usernames interacting with one another, replying to one another, and discussing the history of the song and what they think it might mean or represent. It's a really cool format. It was very strange at the beginning to kind of figure out what was going on, because I've never seen a story written in this format. It's very unique, but it is very interesting as you get more into it. Also, the beginning is mostly people talking about the history of the song, which is entirely fictional history, but then you start them kind of interpreting it, discussing it with one another. There's one person who's researching it. There are some funny moments of people just being people on the internet. So this is a very cool story to read. I don't read a lot of short stories, and I'm trying to incorporate them a bit more into my reading because I do think they are very interesting and tell some really cool stories like this one did. Very unique setup, and if you are interested in trying something a little bit different, I think this one's definitely worth checking out. Then I finally got into my TBR books and read Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. I really liked this story. This follows our main character who has left her home, left her family, and is kind of just doing her own thing, and she starts having these dreams, these nightmares surrounding her sister and something that happened with her, and those dreams start bleeding into her reality. She starts waking up with a piece of her dream in front of her, and it's kind of creeping into her actual life and not just staying in the dreams. So it becomes very alarming. She ends up returning to her family and her home to get help, trying to figure out what's going on and how to stop it. This is a horror story, but it is a very supernatural type of horror, and for the majority of it, it's that kind of unseen but can definitely harm you sort of horror. There's also a lot of family elements. Family is a very big theme. Community and reaching out for help is a big thing within this story. So there are a lot of more day-to-day quiet moments interspersed between all of the more horror things. So it is much more of a slow burn until you get to the end where they've figured out what is causing this to happen and they have some sort of a plan to stop it. Before we get to that real action point, there's a lot of something very scary is obviously going on and kind of lingering the whole time, but then you get some nicer moments of the family being together and getting to know the relatives, and I just think it was really engaging writing style, even having those slower moments, which aren't always things I'm interested in, but I think this was written really well, and that was very important to the story to have those moments. And then you also got the more horror kind of suspense elements without feeling tense the entire time, and to have something very scary kind of looming in the background the whole time rather than an in-your-face kind of slasher type of horror. I thought that was really nice to see, to have horror done in a way that didn't need to be over the top to be scary or suspenseful. Also from the TBR, I read The Book of Gothel by Mary McMine. I liked this story. It was pretty different than I expected. I thought it would be more time at the tower, and there was a lot more moving around than I expected. So this is essentially the origin story of Mother Gothel from Rapunzel. She's the evil witch, or I don't even know what she's actually called in Rapunzel. She's the woman who locks Rapunzel in the tower and keeps her there and raises her as her own confined child. This makes her a much more sympathetic character. You kind of see where she came from. It starts with her in her home life and kind of how she's living, her family, and the people that she has surrounded herself with, and she eventually goes to this tower to find the current Mother Gothel and who she interacts with along the way. For the most part, I really liked this story. I feel like the ending was a little bit of a letdown for me because I feel like we already know who she becomes. But this really took that and turned it over and said, well, she wasn't really a bad person at all. And that was kind of disappointing because it didn't really make sense to me. The ending was a little too, it wasn't really a happily ever after, but it just felt a little too tidy to me. I didn't really love that we were having all of this build up to her being this woman who kidnaps the princess and steals her away to a tower. It kind of altered that, which, I don't know, kind of felt a little disappointing and a little bit like it was changing the story too much. I think it's interesting to have the villain origin stories where you kind of see why maybe they ended up the way that they did the thing that they did. And you do get that in this, but I think it also changed the tone of what she did too much. Maybe that was just the way I interpreted the story, but overall, I really liked the story. I liked the writing of the majority of the story. It was really just the ending that I was a little dissatisfied with. But as far as that sort of historical fantasy fairy tale-ish setting, I think that this did a really good job. I thought it was an interesting story, just seeing her life before she came to be in the tower. So yeah, I didn't love it, but I liked it. I enjoyed it. Then I read Thistlefoot by Jenna Rose Nethercott. This was the third and final standalone that was on my TBR that I was planning to read this month. I ended up DNFing this. I got almost halfway through it, I think, and I was just starting to feel very tedious. It felt like a chore every time I went to pick it up. It was about a estranged brother and sister who are brought back together because they inherit the Baba Yaga house with chicken legs. The sister wants to keep the house, the brother wants to sell it, and he agrees to give her his share if she goes on the road with him for a year's time and does these shows. They are puppet shows. So she agrees simply because she wants to keep the house. So we're following the two of them. There are these murders happening, and you get sort of brief glimpses into those going on from the killer's point of view without ever knowing who they are. And then there's these other people that are tracking that person, and then there's some chapters of, I think it's the house telling the story of Baba Yaga. It's just, there's a lot of things going on, and I didn't feel like they were coming together. I didn't really like either of the siblings. It felt like a lot of things where they were like wondering something or internally asking a question but then never doing it out loud, and that just felt very bizarre to me. Just a complete lack of communication between them and anyone else around them when they were wondering what was going on, especially with all these really big events going on. People like tracking them down, telling them someone's after their house, and then no one asks any questions. It just felt very bizarre to me, and it felt like a lot was going on, but I wasn't really seeing the bigger picture of it all. So I decided if a book is feeling like a chore, it's time to give it up. And that's how this was feeling to me, unfortunately. I thought the main plot was very interesting, but it just was too much to get through it for me. It just wasn't connecting at all, and that to me is not really worth pushing through, especially where this is not a very short book. So, interesting book, probably works for a lot of other people, but I wouldn't really recommend this, unfortunately. Then, as a nice follow-up to that, I read Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett, and I really enjoyed this. This I've been kind of putting on and off of my general TBR of I think I want to read it, but also I don't think I'm going to like it. But I'm really curious because it has so much praise. But also I don't really care about fae stories at all. but I really liked this. It gave me very similar vibes of the memoirs of Lady Trent, The Unnatural History of Dragons, where we have this female scholar who is going out into the field to study a very specific sort of mysterious thing that people have been studying, but we don't really have all the information on. This, of course, follows Emily Wilde, who is researching Fae, and she is writing the first encyclopedia of fairies. She's particularly trying to pin down this one elusive group of Fae. So she goes off to this village on her own to try and track them down and study them so she can finish her encyclopedia. Her friend, Wendell Bamblebee, ends up coming to assist her, deciding she needs help and shouldn't be there by herself. He shows up uninvited and starts helping her, giving her advice and trying to keep her out of trouble. She's not very personable. She's not a very charming person, although she tries to be very polite. She's just not good at social things. Wendell, on the other hand, is incredibly charming and everybody loves him. So I was expecting out of this them to be rivals, first of all, but they're not. They're friends. It says in the synopsis that they're academic rivals or something like that. But actually they're friends. Wendell is Emily's only friend. They've spent a lot of time together. They may have very opposite personalities, but they definitely get along and care about one another and have some sort of history with one another as friends and scholars. I had also heard from some other people that this was a lot darker than they expected and not quite the cozy that it was marketed as. There are definitely some darker things happening than a traditional cozy. It's not just her going out and observing. She's interacting with the Fae. They're obviously tricksters, as they tend to be. They have some very particular rules and practices regarding making deals with one another. It's very tricky because they're always going to try and pull one over on you. And there are some more dangerous situations that they get into, but I didn't find it particularly dark. It's not very gruesome or anything. So this was about the cozy level that I was expecting, where there is some danger involved with the Fae and being around them, immersing herself in their world to really study them. But there's also a nice community element that comes into play. Her relationship with Wendell is obviously very important, and just kind of exploring the different Fae I thought was really interesting, which is not always something that appeals to me, but I think this did it very well in a way that also worked for me. I know there is a sequel coming out, so I'll be picking that up whenever it's out and I get a chance to. But this one was a pleasant surprise for me. Then after that, another book that was a bit disappointing, I read Nocturne by Alyssa Weiss. This I DNF'd. I think I got about 20%, I want to say. And I just wasn't clicking with it. It was what I expected it to be, but that happened to be something that didn't work for me. This is a story of a girl who dreams of becoming a ballerina. You kind of see her early life, and then eventually she grows up and becomes the prima ballerina. She ends up attracting this wealthy, mysterious patron. There's a bit of mystery behind that I think becomes something much bigger if I had gotten further into the story. It's very dreamlike, kind of lyrical writing, a little bit flowery, which is not something I enjoy. And I think it suits the story very well, that writing style. I think it worked very well with what this was about and what was going on. Unfortunately, that's just not a writing style that I like. It's not something I connect with. And that's kind of what I expected, but I thought I'd give it a chance, try something a little bit different, because once in a while that does work for me, so I don't like passing things up just because of that one element. I do think the story would have gotten more engaging and maybe a bit more suspenseful as we got into it and sort of uncovered the mystery behind this patron. I think a lot more would have happened within the story had I gotten further into it, but I decided to just give up on it early. I wouldn't not recommend this, but I also don't think I read enough to say definitively if I think it's worth it or not. It sounded like it could have either really been a hit or really been a miss, and for me it was a miss. Then I read Song of Blood and Stone by El Penelope. I didn't really like this. I read the whole thing. It was fine. I think the main plot and the world were really interesting. Unfortunately, the author didn't really spend a lot of time on those things. So this follows a girl called Jasminda, and she is a farmer. She has her family farm and she needs to pay her taxes. So she goes to pay her taxes and she can't pay them. And then on her way home, she comes across this injured soldier called Jack and ends up helping him. Their lives end up becoming intertwined, and the story kind of goes from there. That's the main setup. The story very heavily focuses on their relationship, their romance. There's racial things happening where there are two races. One of them has magic, one of them does not. They have technology, and they hate each other, and they're kind of on the brink of war. Tensions are really rising between them. These two characters end up in the middle of that. I never really got a good grasp of what the setting was. I don't feel like it was described at all. The world building was really lackluster. The magic involves song somehow, but that's also never really explained. I don't really like magic systems spelled out for me, but this really wasn't explained at all, what was happening, how the magic works, what its capabilities are. There was really nothing given, and it just felt like magic kept happening, but I didn't really understand how or why it was happening. There's also all of these political things going on, and I thought those things were really interesting. I was really surprised how naive Jack seemed to be regarding those things based on his station within this world. I don't know. He's just a good, naive little bean, I guess. But the majority of the story revolves around Jasminda and Jack's relationship. It felt very much like insta-love, but then we sort of backtrack and see them developing their relationship and their feelings for one another, which just felt very juvenile and silly. This is a series. I'm not gonna read the rest of it. Interesting world, cool concept, interesting magic system. It just, the focus was not at all where I wanted it to be. And then the final book I read last month was A Dance with Dragons by George R.R. Martin. This is the fifth and currently the most recent book in A Song of Ice and Fire. I really liked this. The story has gotten so big. I can't even imagine being George R.R. Martin and trying to keep track of all of these little threads. There are so many characters, there are so many things happening, they're all in very different places. This book and the last book especially, I feel like they're extremely long. All of these books are very long. I feel like they're very long, and the characters I'm most interested in, we're seeing what they're doing, but I don't feel like their stories are really moving forward as much as I would want them to. And I think the characters that are mostly moving forward are the characters that I'm not quite as connected with. Obviously, other people are going to be more interested in those characters and be very satisfied with what's happening. It's not that I didn't like these. I really enjoy reading these. I think they're very well written. I think the scope of this world and all of the things going on is just insane. How big of a world it is, how large of a cast of characters it is, and how everything relates to one another. You might see a character in one book and not see them until 2 or 3 books later, and we just kind of pick up with them and see where they've been, what they're up to. And I think that's really cool and really interesting. I think all of these characters are very fleshed out. They are full characters. They're not all just filling a role and serving as one personality trait, and then you get one personality trait, and that's all we get of them. There's just so much depth to what's happening, and intrigue, and all of these very complex relationships and things that are going on. So I think this is a really cool story. I kind of get now why people are a little impatient for the 6th book based on the way that this one ended. There are quite a few cliffhangers at the end, quite a few questions that have since never been answered. I don't know if or when the sixth book will come out. I'll definitely read it when it does. But until then, I am really glad that I read these books, even though the series isn't finished. Just getting to see this world and getting to know these characters has been so much fun. There's so much in it that I probably could go back and read these and get a lot more out of it than I did the first time, because there is so much to take in. I definitely recommend checking these out if you like those bigger fantasy stories. I have a lot of unanswered questions, but I'm not mad about it. So that is everything I read in April. Quite a variety, trying things kind of out of my comfort zone, but not too far off from what I normally read. Picked up some really good things, some things that maybe I didn't love, but I'm glad I tried them. I enjoyed everything I read. These were all things that I was really interested in getting to, reading, trying out, and pretty happy with everything I read in April, even the ones I didn't enjoy. That's all for me today. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll see you next time.